Welcome back, sleepy soul. Tonight, I am your storyteller, ready to drift you into a deep and peaceful sleep. Before we begin, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe for more scary stories. I'd love to hear where you're watching from and what time it is there, so please let me know in the comments. Also, if there's a particular story you'd like to hear next, feel free to suggest it.
The morning fog in Juneau had a strange, metallic taste to it. Cold, sharp, and alive. It clung to the docks where the Norwegian Bliss rested like a sleeping whale, its white hull glowing faintly through the mist. At 9 a.m., Dr. Meredith Bowen stepped off the gangway, her hiking pack fastened tight, her boots freshly cleaned from the last trek in Vermont. She was 62, but moved with the light, careful grace of someone who trusted her balance more than her luck. Locals said the Gold Ridge Trail was a gift on clear days, but that morning the clouds hung low, soft and gray, swallowing the mountaintop like breath on glass. Meredith glanced up from the base of the Mount Roberts tramway, squinting at where the ridge should have been. A curtain of fog had erased it completely. Still, she smiled. She'd hiked in worse. When the tram reached the upper terminal, she was the only passenger who didn't linger for coffee or souvenirs. Cameras caught her moving toward the trailhead, poles in hand, a flash of red jacket vanishing into the wet spruce. That was the last confirmed sighting of her, alive. The Gold Ridge Trail began gently, winding through moss-thick forest where ravens croaked overhead. The air was heavy and wet. Each step stirred the smell of pine needles and earth. Meredith walked with steady rhythm. Breathe, step, check compass, step again. Her breath misted in the cold, and the deeper she went, the quieter everything became. Somewhere beyond the timberline, she stopped to take a photograph. Her phone camera caught a glimpse of the valley below, half drowned in cloud, sunlight flickering through the vapor like something trying to escape. The photo timestamp read 11:32 a.m. It was the last digital record she ever made. By noon, the fog rolled in thicker. It moved like a tide, slow, swallowing the ridge, the trail, the world. She could no longer see the cairns that marked her path. For the first time that morning, she hesitated. Just keep to the left of the ridge, she reminded herself. Follow the line, stay high. But the sound of running water, maybe a small stream or melting snowfield, echoed somewhere below, confusing her bearings. She turned toward it, thinking she could rejoin the path once the fog thinned. The slope dipped under her boots. Pebbles slid. The sound of the stream drew her downward. Minutes became an hour. She never saw the moment she left the trail entirely. When the rain came, it came hard. The Alaskan kind, it isn't just wet, it bites, it seeps, it punishes. Her glasses fogged. The trail beneath her boots turned to slick mud and tundra moss. Every rock looked the same, every tree twisted with the same silent judgment. She tried her compass, but the needle trembled without meaning. The GPS flickered, searching for a signal that never came. Her breath began to quicken. Not panic yet, but the edge of it. Somewhere far off, thunder rolled. Then came the sound that wasn't thunder. It was subtle at first, beneath the wind, a deep creak like pressure building under the earth. Meredith froze. The noise came again, closer this time, vibrating through the wet ground beneath her boots. It felt wrong, organic somehow, like the mountain itself was breathing. She turned, flashlight cutting through fog, and saw nothing but pale vapor and the vague silhouette of a spruce tree bending under invisible weight. The rain eased briefly, but the mist thickened until it became almost solid. The air felt electric, charged. She thought she saw movement, a dark figure crossing the ridge above, but when she blinked, it was gone. By 3 p.m., she realized she'd circled the same boulder twice. Her water bottle was half empty. She shouted once just to break the silence, but her voice came back wrong, flattened, directionless, like the fog itself had eaten it. She checked her phone. No signal. Battery at 19%. She took another photo anyway, blurred, gray, unidentifiable. Later, when rescuers recovered her phone, that image would be the last thing in her gallery. A faint outline, human-shaped, standing where no trail existed. As daylight faded, she found a ledge with enough flat ground to rest. The clouds below glowed faintly with the dying sun, but above her, everything was dark. She set her pack down and tried to make sense of her surroundings. The slope seemed steeper than before. The wind howled with the kind of voice that carried words you didn't quite hear. At one point, she thought she heard someone call her name. She stood, listening. The sound came from somewhere downslope, a man's voice, faint, echoing. "Hello?" she called out, heart lifting. "I'm here." No reply, only wind. She waited a minute, then two, straining her ears. Then came it again, closer this time. "Here." Her flashlight beam cut through the fog. It illuminated nothing. No figure, no tracks, just rocks, moss, and the thin ribbon of a dry gully. But she heard the voice once more, right beside her ear. "Down here." She stumbled back, nearly losing her footing. Her flashlight dropped, rolling across the rock and vanishing into the mist below. For the first time all day, she screamed. The sound never came back. In the darkness, she pressed her palms to her ears, trembling. Her breath fogged the air. Slowly she sat down, hugging her knees, whispering prayers into her jacket sleeve. Rain began again, thin and needling. She waited for morning. No one knows how long she stayed conscious after that. The next day brought heavier clouds, freezing rain, and gusts strong enough to flatten the brush. The rescue teams later said visibility was less than 20 feet. They searched by helicopter, then by foot, but the gold ridge swallowed everything it didn't want found. 4 days passed before a National Guard pilot spotted something red half buried in scree, nearly 1,700 feet below the trail line. Her body lay face down, partially covered in lichen and ice. Her pack was found 20 yards uphill, straps torn as if caught on rock during a fall. Her phone was inside a sealed plastic bag, miraculously dry. The coroner ruled it accidental, hypothermia, and blunt force trauma. But one photograph on that phone puzzled everyone who saw it before it was locked away. It wasn't the one showing fog or rock. It was the one taken hours before she vanished. A shot of the valley from the ridge. Beautiful, except for one thing. In the lower corner, almost lost in mist, stood a dark, upright figure facing her. Too tall, too thin, its head tilted. Investigators assumed it was a hiker she'd passed, but no other hikers were on that section of trail that day. Locals say the Gold Ridge Trail takes someone every few years, not always violently, just quietly. They said the mountain doesn't like to be disturbed when the fog is down, that it hides the path for a reason. When the cruise ship left Juneau that night, the captain made a note in his log, one passenger missing, presumed lost. The rain beat on the decks, steady and relentless. Somewhere high above, The ridge slept again, wrapped in cloud. A year later, a pair of hikers reported hearing a woman's voice calling faintly from a gully near where her body was found. They followed the sound until it led them into mist so thick they could no longer see each other. When the fog cleared, the voice had stopped. Only one hiker made it back to the trailhead that evening. His companion's tracks were found circling a single boulder, again and again, until they simply ended. And on the rock itself, carved into the lichen, were 5 shallow letters, still wet from the rain. M.B.
A quick announcement here. If you're still here and enjoying these stories but haven't subscribed yet, please take a second to do so. Drop a comment too. It really helps push the video out to more people. Your support means everything, and it truly makes my day.
Nome looks like it's clinging to the edge of the world. The town ends abruptly where the tundra begins, a line of shingled roofs giving way to a rolling, treeless sea of moss and stone. Even in summer, the wind is cold enough to sting, and the horizon stretches so far it feels like a dare. That was what drew Joseph Balder, a 36-year-old construction worker from Texas, to move there with his girlfriend, Megan Ryder. Nome had the kind of raw, unfinished quiet that promised a restart. Megan took a job at a local diner. Joseph, restless and curious, signed on with a small building crew, repairing foundations for the seasonal thaw. He told everyone he wanted to earn his Alaska. On his 3rd weekend in town, he decided to explore the tundra northeast of Nome, an overnight trip, 2 days at most. Locals warned him about weather turning fast out there, about the way distances played tricks on the eyes. Joseph laughed it off. He was a soldier once, he told them. He'd hiked mountains hotter than hell and colder than sin. He'd be fine. The morning he left, Megan watched him load his gear into a small 4-wheeled truck. Tent, bear spray, flares, GPS, camera, a week's worth of dehydrated meals. He kissed her, promised to be back by Sunday evening, and drove off toward the gray horizon. He was never seen again. When Joseph didn't return, Megan called the state troopers. By Monday afternoon, the search was underway. Planes, snowmobiles, dogs, volunteers from Nome Search and Rescue. The tundra had been dry that week, patches of permafrost melting just enough to leave soft ground under the brush. 8 miles northeast of town, a pilot spotted something glinting in the low sun. It was Joseph's backpack, sitting upright against a flat boulder, perfectly balanced, as though someone had placed it for a photograph. Inside was everything: his food, his first aid kit, his knife, wallet, phone, GPS, even the rain jacket he always wore. Nothing appeared damaged or misplaced. Only the clothes he'd been wearing, thick jeans, hiking boots, flannel shirt, and coat, were missing. And the camera. When searchers fanned out from the boulder, they expected tracks leading away, prints, drag marks, something. But there was nothing. No tracks in the damp soil, no crushed moss, not even a trace of where he might have sat down. Search dogs were brought in. The animals approached the boulder, circled it, sniffed and whimpered. Then they stopped responding entirely, lying down as if waiting for a command that never came. Their handlers said it was like the dogs had lost the scent mid-air. One handler, a woman named Kay, said later that it felt as though the world around the rock was hollow, the way it goes quiet before an avalanche. The teams searched for 3 weeks, covering 40 miles of tundra in expanding loops. Nothing. No sign of Joseph, no camera, no scraps of clothing. It was as if he'd stood up, stepped forward, and dissolved into the air. To most people outside Alaska, Nome is famous for dog sleds and old gold rush stories, but among those who live there, it's known for something else: disappearances. Between 1960 and 2004, 24 men, most between the ages of 20 and 40, vanished around Nome. Hunters, drifters, miners, newcomers. They went missing without pattern or cause. Some were later found frozen or drowned, but a dozen were never found at all. Locals call it the Nome vanishing pattern. No one agrees on what it is. Some blame alcohol and exposure. Others whisper about lights seen over the tundra, cold blue orbs that hover silently, then blink out when approached. The few believe something older than the town itself walks those plains. Whatever the explanation, Joseph became the 25th. The official report reads like a weather forecast, facts stripped of meaning. Quote, subject, last seen approximately 9 a.m. Saturday, departing Nome on foot after parking vehicle near Teller Road turnoff. Backpack located at 8.3 miles northeast. No further trace. Search concluded due to severe weather and lack of leads. Unquote. But Nome's people keep their own records. One of the troopers, long retired, told a story over whiskey at the Polaris bar. He said that on the final night of the search, he was stationed with another officer, Mark Halter, near the perimeter. Around midnight, a fog rolled in from the coast, thick and white. They decided to call it for the night. Before packing up, Mark took one last look through his thermal scope. At the edge of its range, about 50 yards out, he saw heat. Human-sized, motionless. They called out, thinking it might be Joseph. The shape turned. Then it began to move backward, smooth, gliding, as if the ground itself was pulling it away. The heat signature faded, not smaller, just dimmer, until the scope showed nothing but static. When the fog lifted, they found a patch of flattened moss where the figure had been, perfectly circular, still warm to the touch. No one filed that in the report. Months later, in late winter, Megan received a small package with no return address. Inside was Joseph's missing camera, its memory card intact, but the outer casing cracked. The postmark was from Anchorage, but the Postal Service couldn't trace who dropped it off. On the memory card were 32 photos. The first 20 were normal: hills, tundra grass, low clouds. Then, halfway through, the sky turned greenish, as though a storm were approaching. In photo 21, there's a distant white blur, fog or glare. In 22, it's closer. By 25, it fills the frame. A vertical shimmer, almost like heat distortion, except the air temperature that day had been just above freezing. The last image, time-stamped at 3:47 p.m., shows the boulder where the backpack was found. Behind it, a faint outline, human-shaped but stretched, head tilted unnaturally toward the ground. The next picture is blank, just static noise, grainy and green like a corrupted file. After that, Megan left Nome. She sold Joseph's truck, mailed the camera to state investigators, and moved back to Austin. The state never contacted her again. The file remains open. Status: missing, presumed dead. But those who still work on the tundra sometimes speak of a certain stretch of ground near the old boulder where GPS units flicker and compasses refuse to settle. Hikers say their radios pick up faint whispers on clear days, a man's voice repeating the same thing over and over, too distorted to understand. 2 winters ago, a snowplow driver reported seeing a figure standing in the middle of the frozen plain. He slowed the truck, thinking it was a stranded hiker. When he blinked, the figure was gone, leaving only the shape of a man pressed into the snow, arms at his sides, head turned sharply toward the west. It melted before the troopers arrived. Nome keeps its secrets under ice. The police chief still fields calls from conspiracy theorists, UFO hunters, cryptid chasers, even ex-military researchers who talk about magnetic anomalies and geomagnetic resonance. He says they're all wrong, but when asked why so many vanish in the same place, He always pauses before answering. "It's not the weather," he said once, looking out toward the tundra. "It's something about being alone out there. You stare at that horizon long enough, it starts staring back." He never elaborated. Every year, tourists pass through Nome for sled races or Northern Lights tours, and some stop by the small visitor center near Front Street. In the corner stands a glass display case with mementos from missing residents: photographs, boots, a cracked wristwatch, a note about search efforts. On the bottom shelf, behind a laminated copy of Joseph's photo, is a folded map marked with a faint red X, 8 miles northeast of town. The paper keeps sliding off the pin that holds it, no matter how many times it's fixed. The staff joke that it's the dry air, but sometimes when the wind pushes against the building, you can hear the faint rasp of the map moving by itself. One spring, a group of college hikers from Anchorage tried to locate Joseph's last known spot. They took GPS coordinates from the report and hiked out across the tundra. At 8.2 miles, their instruments began to act strange, cell signals dropping, compass needles spinning. They reached the boulder just before sunset. The pack was gone, but in the dirt beside the stone, half buried by the thaw, was a single boot print. The tread matched the model Joseph had worn, Vask hiking boots, size 10. The print was fresh. It faced toward town. They left within minutes. Today, the Nome disappearances live somewhere between folklore and warning. Some locals say the tundra is alive, that it remembers those who don't belong. Others believe there's a magnetic force.
On the morning of October 16, 1972, Anchorage was wrapped in that eerie autumn stillness that comes right before the first heavy snow. The sun was a pale disk behind a veil of cloud, and the air tasted like cold metal. At 9 a.m., a small twin-engine Cessna 310C, tail number N1812H, taxied down the strip of Anchorage International Airport. Inside were 4 men: pilot Don Johns, congressional aide Russell Brown, and 2 members of Congress, House Majority Leader Thomas Boggs of Louisiana and Alaska Congressman Nicholas Begich. Their flight plan was straightforward: from Anchorage to Juneau, roughly 550 miles southeast, over mountain passes and along lonely coast of the Gulf of Alaska. It should have taken 3.5 hours. The skies were cloudy but flyable. Everyone on board was calm. They'd done this before. When they lifted off, the aircraft looked small against the towering Chugach Mountains, climbing steadily into a sky that was already beginning to thicken with gray. It made its last radio contact near Portage Pass just after 9 a.m. The transmission was routine: weather check, altitude steady, no distress reported. Then silence. No one realized yet that Alaska had just swallowed them whole. When the plane failed to arrive in Juneau by mid-afternoon, the first call went out to air traffic control. Within hours, the largest search operation in Alaska's history began. More than 400 aircraft, countless volunteers, and the U.S. Air Force and Coast Guard scouring the endless wilderness between Anchorage and Juneau. For 39 days they searched. Helicopters hovered over glacial valleys where winds howled at 70 miles an hour. Planes skimmed above snow-capped peaks, eyes straining for even the glint of metal. Search teams trekked through ice fields so vast they could have swallowed a city without a trace. But not one scrap of wreckage, no wing, no seat, no shred of fuselage was ever found. Even the emergency beacon, designed to activate on impact, never sent a signal. It was as though the plane had flown into a different world. Alaska's wilderness has a strange gravity, both physical and spiritual. It draws people in, swallows them, and keeps its secrets under ice and silence. The corridor between Anchorage and Juneau
a triangle of mountains, water, and fog, would later become infamous as the Alaska Triangle. Pilots began to speak of it in hushed tones, of compass needles spinning wildly, radios hissing with phantom voices, and lights seen flickering in valleys where no settlement existed. But in 1972, no one called it that yet. To the search crews, it was still just an impossible mystery. On the fourth day, a Coast Guard pilot reported something odd. While flying low over a glacier near the Chugach Range, he noticed a circular patch of fog that seemed to move against the wind. It wasn't drifting with the current, it was pulsing like a living thing. When he banked the helicopter for a closer look, the fog folded inward and vanished. His co-pilot, stunned, said it looked like a mouth closing. They logged the incident, but were ordered not to pursue it. The weather was deteriorating fast. That night, one of the civilian spotters, a bush pilot named Earl Whitaker, radioed base camp from his small Piper Cub. His voice was calm but strained. He said he'd found something reflective on a ridge near the Knik Glacier. Then there was a burst of static, followed by a final word that no one could make out clearly, something like burning or turning. Whitaker's plane vanished too. His wreckage was found 3 months later, 50 miles off course, embedded in ice. The cockpit was empty. As days turned into weeks, the official narrative began to twist. Rumors circulated that Boggs, known for his outspoken criticism of the FBI, might have been targeted. His family in Washington, D.C. received anonymous calls warning them not to push the investigation. Reporters hinted at political motives, an act of sabotage perhaps masked as an aviation disaster. But locals in Anchorage whispered something different. They spoke of the Triangle, an area bordered roughly by Anchorage, Juneau, and Barrow where planes disappeared and hikers were never found. They said compasses failed there. They said sometimes when the weather turned and the wind fell silent, you could hear engines that weren't there, old prop planes flying routes no radar could see. At the time, nobody wanted folklore. The government wanted answers. But folklore is all they got. By the 21st day, the search base had turned quiet. Fatigue had replaced adrenaline. Snow was falling steadily, muting the drone of generators. Then, just after dusk, a radio operator picked up a faint signal on an emergency frequency, a garbled voice, distorted, looping every 40 seconds. The words were nearly lost under static, but analysts thought they could make out 3 phrases. Pottage, white light, we're not alone. The signal repeated for 11 minutes, then cut off. A Coast Guard team scrambled helicopters and triangulated the source somewhere near the Harding ice field, one of the most treacherous terrains on Earth. They found nothing. The voice was never heard again. By the end of November, winter closed in hard. The search was officially suspended. Families held funerals without bodies. Newspapers across the country printed the same line, "Presumed dead." But Alaska never stopped whispering. 10 years later, in 1982, a geology survey helicopter passing through the same corridor reported strong magnetic interference. Their navigation instruments froze, and the onboard compass spun violently before stabilizing. When they regained signal, their GPS log showed they drifted 12 miles off course, over the same area where N1812H had vanished. The pilot described seeing ribbons of light under the ice like aurora borealis trapped beneath the glacier. In 1995, hikers exploring a ridge near Portage Pass found a piece of aluminum protruding from the scree. It was about the size of a man's hand, with faint serial numbers worn by time. The FAA tested it and confirmed it came from a Cessna 310, but could not conclusively match it to the missing aircraft.
What troubled investigators wasn't the fragment itself, it was the depth. The rock formation that encased it had shifted during the '89 quake, meaning the metal had been buried beneath 20 years of solid ground. It should not have been visible. Today, the flight of N1812H sits at the center of Alaska's strangest legend. Locals call it the day the sky took 4 men. Some say the plane flew into a magnetic anomaly, an area where electromagnetic fields bend light and distort instruments. Others insist the storm that day was far worse than reported, that it sheared the plane apart mid-air, scattering debris so widely it would never be found. But a handful of people, especially the bush pilots who still fly those routes, talk about it differently. They say that sometimes, on calm mornings, radios in the Chugach Mountains pick up an old transmission, 4 voices, calm, professional, chatting about air pressure and altitude. It always ends the same way, static, then a man saying, "We're right on schedule." No one has ever traced that frequency. On the 50th anniversary of the disappearance, a historian named Eleanor Pike obtained declassified portions of the search records. Buried in the reports was a handwritten note from an Air Force observer dated October 20th, 1972. It wasn't meant for the public. Strange phenomenon over Harding ice field. 3 unidentified radar echoes matching N1812 trajectory. All disappear at 9:12 a.m. No wreckage visible. Visual confirmation impossible due to optical interference. Recommend cessation of low-altitude search in affected area. Optical interference. Radar echoes. The phrases read like excuses, but in the margin, someone had scrawled a single word: mirrored. Eleanor asked surviving searchers what it might mean. Most shrugged it off. One, however, said he remembered it well. The ground that day, he said, looked like glass. You couldn't tell where the clouds ended and the ice began. If that plane went down there, it didn't crash. It just slipped under. In Juneau, a bronze plaque still lists the names: Thomas Hale Boggs, Nicholas Begich, Russell Brown, and Don Johns. People stop and read it without really thinking, but in Anchorage, old pilots still tell new ones not to fly that corridor alone. They say compasses go mad near Portage. They say some nights, if you look down,
Nome sits at the edge of nothing. Wind from the Bering Sea rolls in cold and endless, scraping the shore with frost and salt. Beyond the houses, the beach stretches west until it disappears under fog. A horizon so lonely it feels like a wound. In late September 2021, Florence Okuluk lived in a small tent at the edge of West Beach, part of the makeshift encampment where Nome's Forgotten drifted between days. She was 36, a quiet woman from Wales, a village hundreds of miles away where the ocean froze into silence every winter. She'd come to Nome for better medical care and maybe a chance at something resembling safety. But safety doesn't exist here, not for people like her. Her tent sat near the dunes, flanked by old fishing nets and driftwood. Inside were her prescriptions, a photograph of her daughter, a tattered sleeping bag, and a heavy winter coat. She rarely left it unattended. The other campers said Florence kept to herself, but smiled often, especially when the sun broke through and lit the sea in copper streaks. On the morning of September 28, she told her neighbor, Lisa Hendricks, that she was going for a short walk to clear her head. The sky was pale blue, the kind that fools you into thinking the cold won't bite. She carried nothing but a pair of gloves and a small pouch of seashells she liked to collect. Lisa said Florence waved as she walked down the beach. That was the last time anyone saw her. By evening, the wind turned sharp. When darkness fell and Florence hadn't returned, Lisa went to check her tent. Her sleeping bag was neatly rolled, her medicine untouched, her wallet still zipped inside her duffel bag. Most unsettling of all, her heavy coat hung on a nail, dry and warm from the sun earlier that day. Lisa ran to the road and flagged down a patrol car. The Nome police arrived before midnight, their flashlights sweeping across the sand dunes and shoreline. They found nothing. No footprints, no drag marks, not even the shape of where she'd lain down. Just the ocean, heaving under the moonlight. The next morning, volunteers gathered to search. They formed a line combing the beach from the jetty to the west point. It took 2 days before they found something. 2 miles from camp, arranged neatly on the sand, lay a pair of black sneakers, a pair of socks folded beside them, and a gray hooded sweatshirt placed on top. Stacked, not tossed. There were no footprints leading to or away from the spot. The sand was smooth, untouched except for faint wave marks. Someone whispered it looked like a shrine. The Coast Guard scoured the waters for a week. Divers searched near the breakwater, and helicopters traced the shoreline as far as Teller. No body, no clothing, no sign of a fall. Investigators concluded she must have wandered into the ocean in a state of distress, another tragedy of homelessness and cold. But the people who lived near Florence didn't believe that. She'd been saving money, waiting on her housing application, talking about getting an apartment. She wasn't the kind to give up. They said the way her clothes were folded didn't make sense. Florence was proud. She would never undress in public. And if she had entered the water, the tide would have scattered the items, not left them arranged above the high water line. That winter, Nome sunk into darkness. 20 hours of night, with the sea crusted in ice and wind cutting through the streets like a blade. Search efforts ended, but her name stayed pinned to the community board outside the post office. Missing, Florence Okuluk. Underneath, someone had written in marker, "Find her, don't forget." People whispered that West Beach was cursed, that the ocean takes what the town won't protect. It wasn't the first disappearance, nor the last. Since the 1990s, more than 20 Native women had vanished or been found dead around Nome. Police said many were accidents, alcohol, exposure, freezing weather. But the locals had another explanation. They said something walks the coastline when the fog rolls in. In January, during a rare, clear night, a fisherman named Howard Briggs was repairing nets near the old pier. Around midnight, he saw a woman standing by the frozen tide line, long hair whipping in the wind. She was barefoot. He shouted, thinking she needed help. The woman turned slowly. Her face was pale, her eyes too dark to see clearly from that distance. Howard ran toward her, but when he looked up again, she was gone. Only a set of footprints led halfway across the ice before fading. He swore to the police the next morning that it was Florence. Same build, same coat she used to wear, except it was moving like it was underwater. They didn't believe him. By spring, the sea ice broke apart, washing up the debris of winter, nets, bottles, pieces of driftwood, a half-sunk snowmobile. On April 19th, a park ranger found something near the rocks, a single mitten, dark gray, with Florence's initials stitched on the cuff in fading thread. It was dry. Megan Ryder, who had lost her boyfriend, Joseph, to another Nome disappearance years earlier, came forward to help the Okuluk family navigate the system. She told them what the authorities wouldn't, that cases like this almost never close. They fade like breath in the cold. But Megan said something else too, that in Nome, the land remembers. The tundra doesn't forget what it swallows. Locals started leaving small offerings along West Beach after that, candles in glass jars, shells, ribbons tied to driftwood. On calm nights, the wind carried a faint hum across the dunes, a sound like humming or singing, low and soft, always coming from the direction of the water. No one went walking alone after dark anymore. In late summer 2022, a group of anthropology students visited Nome to study erosion patterns near where Florence's clothes were found. They noticed a shallow depression in the sand about the size of a grave. Beneath the surface, the sand was compacted, not by water, but by weight. They excavated less than a foot before they stopped. Under the top layer of sand, there was something smooth, white, and cold to the touch. It wasn't bone, not quite, more like polished shell or porcelain. When they shone a light on it, moisture beaded on the surface, glistening as though it had just come out of water. A moment later, the tide surged unexpectedly, higher than the forecast predicted. It filled the depression and erased it completely. When the students returned the next day, the area looked untouched. Today, Florence's case remains officially open, but cold. The Nome police file lists it under missing, presumed deceased. But if you ask the locals, they'll tell you she's still walking somewhere between the shore and the fog, her bare feet leaving no prints, her coat still hanging where she left it. The indigenous women who still live rough near West Beach say that sometimes when the wind comes from the west, they feel a pressure in the air, a weight that makes the heart slow. The dogs refuse to sleep. Radios hiss. The air smells faintly of salt and something sweet, like lilac. And on nights when the tide is high, the waterline glows faintly, just a shimmer like moonlight on wet skin. They call it Florence's Walk. No one stays out when it begins. The ocean around Port Protection has a kind of silence that isn't empty. It listens, it waits. The small Alaskan settlement, tucked between forested cliffs and black water, looks like a forgotten corner of the map. Just 20 houses cling to the shoreline like barnacles, their docks creaking in the tide. Outsiders rarely stay long. But Lucas Avery wasn't an ordinary visitor. He arrived in August 2021, steering a weathered 19-foot sea kayak painted a dull orange. Locals remember watching him glide into the harbor at sunrise, a stranger with a soft southern accent and eyes that always seemed fixed on something beyond the horizon. He told the harbor master he was a maritime engineer from Oregon, taking time off to paddle through the inside passage alone. He stayed 3 nights, sleeping in his kayak near the pier, and then said he was heading toward El Capitan Island, a cluster of limestone coves and tidal rapids notorious among experienced paddlers. "Just scouting," he'd said, smiling. "I like the kind of silence that tests you." On August 22, at 8:14 a.m., he radioed his position to another boater near Point Baker. "Calm seas," he said, "heading for El Capitan. We'll check in tonight." That was his last transmission. When he didn't check in by evening, a few locals figured he'd camped overnight. But by the next morning, when his radio stayed silent, they called the Coast Guard. By noon, the first search helicopter spotted his kayak drifting upside down 3 miles northeast of El Capitan Island. The hull was intact, the paddle leash snapped, and the emergency flare gun still sealed inside the waterproof bag. The tide had turned during the night, pushing the kayak in a lazy spiral toward the open sea. But there was something missing: the life vest Lucas always wore. The search team expanded outward in circles, sweeping the frigid channels between islands. They found pieces of gear scattered like breadcrumbs: a dry bag, a metal thermos, a waterproof notebook. None of it looked torn or dragged by rocks. Everything had been placed by the current, as if arranged carefully, one piece at a time. The Coast Guard assumed he'd capsized in the El Capitan Rapids, a stretch where tidal surges can shift direction in seconds, sucking air and water into violent spirals. Even a skilled paddler could vanish in an instant. The water temperature that week hovered around 47 degrees F, cold enough to paralyze within minutes. But the locals of Port Protection weren't convinced. Two fishermen, Grant and Milton Clark, claimed they'd seen strange lights that night. 3 white orbs hovering low over the channel around 10 p.m., drifting silently against the wind. They said the lights flickered, then blinked out all at once. When asked later, Grant swore he heard something afterward. Not thunder, he said, more like the sea groaned. You could feel it in your bones. The Coast Guard dismissed it as atmospheric reflection from boat lanterns, but the men insisted no one else was out there. That's dead water. No one sails those tides at night. On the 4th day of the search, the weather turned vicious. Rain slashed sideways, the wind rising to 60 knots. The sea turned black and mean. Still, the search crews pressed on. A helicopter crew reported seeing something on the cliffs of El Capitan Island, a red scrap, possibly from Avery's kayak jacket. When a team finally landed 2 days later, the red scrap was gone. What they found instead was a small cave halfway up the cliff, reachable only by rope. Inside, the walls were dry and smooth. Someone had scratched a pattern into the rock, parallel lines crossing like waves, repeated again and again, 12 sets in total. At the center of the wall was a single word, carved deep into the limestone: listen. The carving matched the knife found in Avery's kayak, a foldable Gerber model with a serrated edge. Investigators couldn't determine when the markings were made, but salt crystals had already begun forming inside the grooves. They'd been there at least a day before the storm. The search was suspended after 2 weeks. The Coast Guard's official report listed the cause as probable drowning due to accidental capsizing in tidal surge. But among the fishermen and homesteaders of Port Protection, the story grew darker. One of the last people to speak with Avery was Eleanor Scott, a retired schoolteacher who ran the small supply shack near the harbor. She remembered something odd from their conversation the morning he left. He asked if anyone ever heard voices out near El Capitan. I thought he was joking, but he looked serious. Said he heard something the night before, a deep hum under the water, like a foghorn, only human. She told him it was probably the rocks or the tide echoing. He just nodded and said, "No, ma'am." This was listening. Weeks after the search ended, Eleanor claimed she began hearing it too. A low vibration rolling through the bay, strongest just before dawn, rattling the window panes of her shack. She wasn't the only one. Others in town heard it. Always the same pitch, always lasting exactly 1 minute, as if something enormous beneath the water was calling to shore. Some said it was seismic activity. Others said it was grief taking form in sound. But one night, a young deckhand recorded it on his phone. The audio was faint but clear, a deep, rhythmic pulse, followed by what sounded unmistakably like a man's voice exhaling 3 long breaths, and then silence. The recording lasted 12 seconds. months later, in February, a fisherman dredging his nets near the rapids channel caught something heavy. When he hauled it in, he found a sealed camera case tangled in kelp. Inside was a waterproof GoPro, scratched but functional. It belonged to Lucas Avery. The footage showed short clips, calm seas, cliffs, seals drifting past the kayak. Then, near sunset, the water began to churn oddly, forming circular ripples around his boat. He lifted the camera, turning it toward the cliffs, where something white shimmered under the surface, large and slow-moving. Then came a sound, not wind, not current, but a low resonance, a hum so deep it distorted the audio. The camera jolted, pointing skyward. The final frame froze on a still image of Avery's face, eyes wide, looking toward something behind the lens. The timestamp read 8:59 p.m. 1 minute later, the feed cut to static. The footage was sent to investigators, who later claimed the distortion was consistent with electromagnetic interference caused by storm activity, but there was no storm recorded that night. Locals who saw the video before it disappeared into evidence said the reflection in Avery's eyes wasn't light, it was movement, something massive rising beneath the kayak, its surface rippling like liquid glass. Today, the people of Port Protection still speak of the El Capitan sound, a deep vibration that comes and goes without warning. Some nights it rattles window panes, other times it hums just beneath the tide. The Coast Guard calls it thermal resonance. The locals call it a warning, because the last time it was heard, the morning after Avery vanished, the tide charts went blank for nearly 2 hours. Instruments failed. The water stood perfectly still, glassy and black, reflecting the cliffs like a mirror. Eleanor Scott swears she saw something move under that reflection, something tall, pale, and slow, before the first ripples broke the surface and the bay began to breathe again. They never found Lucas's body, but every August, when the fog rolls in from the west, the people of Port Protection say you can still hear the rhythm of his paddles striking water, steady, echoing, fading toward the open sea, followed by that same deep whisper rolling through the tide like an answer. Listen.
The Susitna Valley lies like a wound across Alaska's center, wide, white, and utterly silent in February. The cold there is not merely temperature, it's presence. It presses into your skin, seeping through fabric and bone until your thoughts move slower and your heartbeat sounds like something trying to escape. That's where Molly Winthrop, a 43-year-old nature photographer from Vermont, had come to chase the northern lights. She'd been to Alaska once before, in summer, but the winter fascinated her. The endless night, the sharp stars, the way light could burn across the sky without making a sound. She booked a 2-week stay at a small wood-framed outpost called the Aurora Lodge, 50 miles northwest of Anchorage and 12 miles from the nearest road. The place had 5 cabins, a main hall, and a frozen lake that shimmered like glass when the moon hit it right. There was no phone signal, only radio. And the owner, Harvey Brooks, was a quiet man who kept a log of every guest like a ritual. Molly arrived on February 10th, bundled in 3 layers, camera bags slung across her shoulder. The temperature that night dropped to negative 25 degrees Fahrenheit. She spent the first few days scouting locations, abandoned trails, ice ridges, the edge of the lake where frost formed intricate webs across the reeds. Other guests described her as polite but distant, always awake at strange hours, often walking out past midnight with a tripod over her shoulder. On the evening of February 15th, the lights appeared. Bright, pulsing green with streaks of violet, the kind that make the snow itself glow. Molly told Harvey she was heading out around 10:30 p.m. to shoot from the lake's far side. "I'll get the aurora's reflection," she said, grinning. She never came back. When she didn't show up for breakfast, Harvey checked her cabin. The door was unlocked. The bed was unslept in. Her camera bag was gone, but her heavy parka, the one with the fur-lined hood she never went without, was hanging neatly in the closet. That was the first detail that made no sense. It was lethal outside without proper insulation. In that temperature, exposed skin freezes in under 5 minutes. Harvey radioed the state troopers immediately. By afternoon, the search began. Snowmobiles cut across the lake, their engines echoing into emptiness. Helicopters circled overhead, though visibility was poor, the kind of thin mist that blurs the line between air and snow. No tracks led away from the cabin, none led toward the lake either. Overnight snowfall might have covered them, but the drifts near her door were untouched, smooth as paper. It was as though she had stepped into air and vanished before the first flake fell. The next day, they found the first clue, half a mile from the lodge, near the lake's center. A small tripod, frozen upright in the ice. Her camera was missing, but the metal legs were embedded solidly, untouched by wind or snow. Whoever had set it there hadn't taken a single photograph, or had taken one and then vanished before removing it. The searchers marked the site with a red flag. They drilled holes in the ice, lowering cameras and sonar. Nothing but darkness below. No shapes, no movement, just endless cold water reflecting the pale shimmer of the sky. By the third day, they expanded the search into the nearby forest. Dogs were brought in, though they struggled with the temperature. One handler swore the dogs began whining when they approached the lake, refusing to step onto the ice. She said they acted like something was under it later. When night fell, the aurora returned. Green curtains rippled across the black sky, bending and folding as if breathing. Harvey watched from the lodge window. In one flash of violet light, he thought he saw something move on the ice, just a shadow, faint but unmistakable, the outline of a woman standing where the tripod had been. He blinked, and it was gone. Investigators combed through Molly's belongings. Her laptop contained hundreds of photos, snow textures, frost patterns, long exposures of the night sky. But the final image, time-stamped 12:42 a.m., showed something strange. The picture was taken from the frozen lake's edge, aimed toward the tree line. The aurora flared above, a luminous veil of green. But in the lower corner, faint and half-blurred, there was a figure reflected in the ice. At first glance, it looked like Molly. Same frame, same hood. But when the image was digitally enhanced, the reflection's face was turned toward the camera, though the standing figure was facing away. The search was suspended after 10 days. Officially, the report concluded she had likely fallen through thin ice near the lake center, her body trapped under the frozen layers. But Harvey didn't believe that. He knew that lake better than anyone. The ice that winter was over 2 feet thick. It couldn't have broken under a single person's weight. Still, he didn't argue. He closed the lodge for the season, leaving the cabins locked and the generator drained. Spring came late that year. When Harvey returned in May to reopen, the ice had melted, leaving the lake calm and clear. When cleaning the shoreline, he found something glinting beneath the water. A camera, wedged between two rocks in the shallows. He dried it, charged it, and turned it on. The last video was time-stamped February 15th, 12:51 a.m. The footage began with Molly's gloved hands adjusting the focus. The aurora shimmered faintly above. She was breathing hard, her voice muffled under the wind. "Still here," she whispered. "It's so quiet. The ice hums." She turned the lens toward the horizon. There was a faint vibration, low and rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat coming through the mic. Then, the lights brightened, so bright that the snow turned blue. The vibration deepened, the camera shook. Molly gasped, stepping back. "What is that?" she said. The ice beneath her began to pulse, not crack, not break, but move. It flexed upward like something underneath was pressing to get out. She dropped the camera. The lens caught her boots as she stumbled backward. The light intensified until the entire frame went white and a sound filled the air, neither human nor mechanical. It was a tone, deep and endless, vibrating through the bones. Then, silence. The recording ended. Harvey handed the footage to investigators, who later dismissed it as distortion from coal damage, but he didn't buy that either. The tone was too clear, too deliberate. He closed the lodge permanently that year. Today, the cabins still stand, buried in snow. Locals who venture near the valley say strange things happen at night. Radios crackle with static when pointed toward the lake. Compass needles spin. And on rare windless nights, when the aurora burns brightest, the ice glows from below, pale green light rising like breath. One trapper, camping nearby, swore he saw footprints leading across the frozen surface. Bare, small, perfectly formed, ending in the middle of the lake where the tripod once stood. The next morning, the prints were gone. But sometimes, when the lights dance high over the Susitna Valley, travelers claim they can see the faint silhouette of a woman standing in the distance, camera in hand, head tilted to the sky, her reflection facing the wrong direction. They call her the photographer of the aurora, and they say the ice still hums beneath her feet.
The air near Exit Glacier carries a sound that isn't quite wind, more like a whisper under the ice, something breathing through the cracks. The people who hike there often talk about that sound afterward. Soft, rhythmic, almost human. In the summer of 2023, Anthony Rios, a 51-year-old civil engineer from Colorado, arrived in Seward with a camera bag, a smile, and a ticket for an 8-hour guided trek across the glacier terminus in Kenai Fjords National Park. It was his first trip to Alaska, and he'd told his sister he wanted to see what the Earth looked like before it decided to forgive us. He boarded the bus with 8 others that morning, tourists in bright jackets, a guide named Rachel Warren, and 2 young interns helping with gear. The day was clear, sunlight bouncing off the ice like glass. They hiked in pairs, tethered by safety ropes, following the blue trail markers that traced the glacier's surface. Anthony was quiet but eager. He carried 2 cameras and stopped often to photograph meltwater streams, cutting veins through the ice. He said, "I like the way light gets trapped." She laughed and said, "Just don't get too close. The glacier likes souvenirs." They reached a rocky outcrop around noon and broke for lunch. Anthony moved to the edge, crouching to line up a photo of the ice valley below. The wind carried his laughter up to the others. He waved once. That was the last time anyone saw him alive. On the return hike, Rachel did a head count at the junction near the ridge, 1 number short.
She turned back immediately, calling his name, scanning the horizon for his red jacket. Nothing. At first, they assumed he'd stopped to take more photos. They waited. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. By the time they retraced their steps, his footprints had already softened into the ice. The park rangers were alerted by 3:30 p.m. Helicopters circled within the hour, sweeping the crevices with infrared sensors. Nothing registered. On the second day, they found his camera in a narrow ravine about a mile from the outcrop. It sat upright, lens cap on, as if someone had placed it there deliberately. The camera's outer body was clean, no cracks, no scratches, no signs of a fall. The SD card held 74 photographs, all from earlier in the day. The last image was time-stamped 12:37 p.m., a wide shot of the rocky ledge, bright sky above, and the faint outline of his group in the distance. There were no further photos. The area where the camera was found was treacherous, a deep cleft bordered by slick rock and ice, accessible only by rope. Yet the base of the ravine was smooth, free of debris. If Anthony had fallen, the camera should have shown damage or scuffing. The next clue came on the third day. A helicopter crew spotted something red halfway down a slope beyond the ravine, possibly his jacket. A team repelled to investigate. It wasn't the jacket, it was a glove, frozen stiff, clutching a small chunk of glacier ice. When they pried the fingers open, the ice inside melted in the sun, leaving a single clear drop that evaporated before it touched the ground. On the fifth day, searchers began referring to the site as the Hollow. Radios crackled there, and GPS devices lost signal without explanation. One ranger swore that when she shouted Anthony's name into the ravine, she heard her own voice echo back a second later, too quickly, too close, like someone else repeating it from just behind her. The official explanation would later attribute it to glacial acoustics. On the sixth night, one of the search volunteers, Derek, awoke in his tent to the faint sound of a camera shutter clicking. He thought someone was testing equipment, but when he stepped outside, the sound wasn't coming from the camp. It echoed from somewhere near the glacier's edge, slow, steady, one click every few seconds. He followed it for 100 yards before it stopped. The next morning, they found boot prints near his path, large, single direction, leading toward the ravine. They matched Anthony's boots, but the tread marks ended abruptly at a sheer ice wall. When the search ended, officials cited hypothermia or a hidden crevice. They said he must have wandered off and fallen, his body sealed beneath the shifting ice. But Rachel never accepted that. In her incident report, she described something that never made it into the public file. She wrote that just before leaving the outcrop, she'd noticed Anthony standing unusually still, facing the glacier wall. The others had already moved on. He wasn't taking photos. His hands hung at his sides. She called out to him, but he didn't respond. She wrote, he looked like he was listening, not to us, to the ice. A month later, a park maintenance crew, clearing debris after a melt, found a scrap of paper pressed against the base of a rock. It was a torn page from a field notebook, Anthony's, based on the handwriting. The page contained coordinates, nothing else but a sentence written across the bottom. The ice remembers what it swallows. That fall, when the first freeze returned, a climber named Evan Lister took a photo from the ridge above the ravine. It was an ordinary shot, just the glacier, smooth and blue under thin sunlight. But when he examined it later, he noticed a faint shadow near the base of the ice wall. The shape was human, upright, frozen mid-step, as if halfway through emerging from the ice, or halfway back in. Evan deleted the photo and refused to discuss it again. Over time, stories about Anthony's disappearance became part of Seward's glacier lore. Guides warned tourists not to stray too far from the trail. They said the glacier breathes, inhales and exhales through cracks you can't see. Step too close and it might mistake you for air. Some nights, when the wind is still and the aurora glows pale green over the ice, the park rangers hear it again, the faint metallic click, click of a camera somewhere deep inside the glacier. 2 winters after Anthony vanished, a violent thaw exposed new fissures in the ice field. Explorers rappelled into one of them to map the caverns below. In the 3rd chamber, 60 feet down, they found something glinting inside a transparent wall of ice, a watch, hands frozen at 12:39. Next to it, faint but unmistakable, was the impression of a face, mouth open, eyes wide, staring upward. When the team returned days later with heat lamps to melt through the ice, the watch and the imprint were gone. The wall was smooth again, seamless, as if it had never been disturbed.
Up there, at the very top of the world, sound travels differently. It doesn't echo, it disappears. The tundra absorbs everything: footsteps, voices, even the hum of machinery. By the time winter reaches Utqiagvik, America's northernmost town, silence feels like another form of weather. That's what Samantha Harding had come for. At 29, she was one of those rare travel bloggers who wasn't chasing luxury or clicks. Her readers followed her for stillness, for her posts about remote ice fields, forgotten trails, and nights spent under strange skies. When she arrived in Utqiagvik in early September, she wrote her final entry before vanishing. The Arctic doesn't feel empty.
It feels like something watching you breathe. Her plan was ambitious. She wanted to document a 3-day solo photography expedition north along the Mead River, capturing the first auroras of the season. She'd rented an ATV, packed 2 cameras, emergency gear, food for 4 days, and a satellite GPS beacon. Locals advised against going alone. The tundra, they warned, could play tricks on even seasoned travelers. Samantha smiled. "That's why I'm going," she said. On September 3rd, she left just before noon, the sky the color of old steel. Her GPS tracker pinged regularly throughout the day, each signal placing her deeper into the tundra. Around 9 p.m., the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving the landscape bathed in pale blue twilight. Her final confirmed position came at 11:47 p.m., exactly 1 mile west of a frozen lake. The last photograph on her camera, later recovered, showed the aurora borealis spilling across the sky like green smoke. After that, nothing. When Samantha didn't return by the 4th day, her hosts alerted the North Slope Search and Rescue. A helicopter followed her GPS trail until it simply stopped. Her ATV was found upright, perfectly parked near the lake's edge, as though she'd stopped for a moment and stepped off. Inside the cargo compartment were her rations, first aid kit, and a small thermos of coffee, still half full and unspoiled by the cold. Her jacket, gloves, and boots were missing. The tundra temperature that night had dropped below 20 degrees F. The search teams expanded outward. 2 days later, they found her camera and tripod a mile from the ATV. The tripod was still standing, its legs firmly embedded in the permafrost. The camera had been set to time-lapse mode, capturing the aurora in long exposures. The final frame showed streaks of green and violet light, but something else too. In the bottom corner, near the horizon, there was a faint vertical smudge, darker than the rest of the landscape. It wasn't a shadow, it had definition. It looked like a person. They followed the direction of the camera's angle. For another mile, then 2. Nothing. The strangest part was the ground. Even in freezing conditions, the tundra retains a soft layer of moss and soil that records tracks easily. But around the camera site, the surface was smooth, no tracks, no depressions. It was as if the earth had reset itself after she left. That night, the wind came from the east, bringing fog thick enough to erase the horizon. The helicopters were grounded. One of the search volunteers, an older man named Jonas Teal, who'd worked rescue for 30 years, claimed he heard a voice on the open-frequency radio around midnight. It was faint, crackling through static. A woman's voice. She said, "It's so quiet." Then, "I think it's listening." Jonas answered, shouting her name into the mic. There was a pause, then the same words again, same tone, same rhythm, identical. The signal cut out after that. The recording of the exchange was lost when the radio battery shorted the next morning. On the 5th day, the weather cleared. They brought in scent dogs. The animals sniffed her belongings, circled the ATV, and then began pacing in tight circles around the frozen lake. One dog lay down and refused to move. Another barked once, then started whining. "Sometimes they know," one rescuer said quietly. Locals began to talk about it in whispers. The Mead River Lights, they called them. Old Inupiat hunters used to tell stories about the land north of Utqiagvik, of the Angat, the silent ones, who lived beneath the ground and could mimic voices to lure travelers off their path. The stories said, if you ever heard your own voice calling you in the distance, you must run the other way. 3 weeks after the official search was suspended, a hunter named Raymond Hill spotted something unusual near the same lake. A line of frost on the tundra, perfectly straight, glowing faintly under his flashlight.
He followed it for 100 yards before it ended abruptly at a shallow depression in the earth. When he shone the light down, he saw something buried just beneath the surface, a piece of cloth, pale blue, with a broken metal zipper. Her jacket. It was folded neatly, not torn or weathered, the fabric clean, as though freshly washed. When he looked again, the frost line was gone. By October, Utqiagvik's sun had vanished for the season. The searchers left, the equipment packed away, the ice reclaiming the land. But people still talked. Hunters swore they saw flashes of green light moving along the horizon, slow, deliberate, nothing like the natural aurora. And then there was the signal. The Alaska communication station recorded a brief GPS ping, 1 second, no coordinates, coming from Samantha's old beacon at 11:47 p.m. on November 3rd, exactly 2 months after she disappeared. The timestamp matched the last moment her camera had captured the sky. When a small team went to investigate, they found only the frozen lake, silent, under a curtain of mist. By spring thaw, a research group mapping the permafrost near the Mead River discovered something buried under 12 inches of ice, Samantha's second camera, encased in a thin layer of frost. It was still functional. The last video began with her breathing, steady but quick, the aurora pulsing above. She whispered, "It's whispering again." She turned the lens towards the lake, which shimmered faintly despite the darkness. She said the ground's vibrating. It feels like something beneath. Then in the distance, a faint shape began to rise, a distortion, bending the air like heat over asphalt. It grew taller, thinner, until it looked almost human. Samantha gasped and began backing away. The camera shook violently, her voice turned to static. Then she said, barely audible, "It's not cold anymore." The screen went black. The footage was sealed by investigators and never released. Locals, though, tell their own version. They say the tundra lights still appear each September, following the same line where she vanished. Some nights they move, weaving like green ribbons. Other nights they stay still, forming the faint shape of a woman standing by the frozen lake, camera in hand, waiting for the aurora to begin again. No one goes that far north after dark now. Not the hunters, not the scientists, not even the elders who remember the old stories. Because in the Arctic, silence isn't absence, it's attention. And if you listen closely enough on those still nights, you can hear the snow shift, like something turning beneath it, and a voice carried on the wind, calm, familiar, almost tender, saying, "It's so quiet." Then, fainter still, "I think it's listening."
Even in daylight, Skagway's fjords look haunted, sheer cliffs wrapped in mist where light moves slow and sound seems to fold back on itself. Few venture deep into the narrow inlets anymore. The weather changes without warning, and fog can roll in so thick that compasses fail. But for scientists like Dr. Eleanor Vance, danger was part of the allure. She was 45, a climatologist from Boston with a reputation for chasing impossible data sets. Her goal was to recover a set of ice core samples left behind by a 1920s expedition somewhere deep within a remote fjord north of the Taya Inlet. Those cores, if found, could reveal a century of untouched atmospheric history. She led a 3-person team: Ben Crawford, a 28-year-old geologist and her field assistant, and Merrill Jensen, a documentary filmmaker covering the project for an environmental network. Their mission was to spend 5 days camping at the base of a rapidly receding glacier known locally as Dead Run, a place that didn't appear on most maps. Locals told them not to go. That fjord's got its own weather, one fisherman warned. Fog comes in like it's thinking. Eleanor laughed. Then we'll think with it. They arrived by float plane on a Tuesday morning in early July. The fjord looked like a wound cut straight into the mountain, jagged walls rising on both sides, the glacier at the far end glowing faintly blue under an overcast sky. They set up camp near a rock shelf, close enough to the meltwater stream for fresh supply, but far enough from the shifting ice to stay safe. Eleanor logged their coordinates and radioed base. Conditions stable, we'll begin excavation at 1300 hours. That was her last transmission. The next day, the base station expected a morning check-in. It never came. They waited until evening, then called by radio. No reply. By the second day, the Alaska State Troopers dispatched a helicopter. When it approached the fjord, the pilot reported something strange. An unusually dense fog layer, unmoving, almost metallic in color. He described it as like smoke trapped in glass. Visibility dropped to 0. They couldn't land. The pilot circled twice before retreating to a safer airspace. That fog wasn't weather, he told dispatch later. It was there before I arrived, and it was still there when I left. When the weather finally cleared on the 5th day, a ground team made it into the fjord. The camp was exactly where the coordinates placed it. Both tents were still standing, zipped shut. Inside were sleeping bags neatly rolled, half-eaten rations, and notebooks spread open beside a cold stove. There were no signs of struggle, no animal tracks, no footprints beyond their own. Dr. Vance's laptop sat on a crate outside the tent, the screen frozen on her last entry. It read, "Retrieved core sample successfully. Weight approximately 300 pounds. Composition unusual. Not standard glacial ice. Density inconsistent. We'll analyze tomorrow." That was dated July 12th, 6:04 p.m. The core sample she mentioned, 3 cylindrical containers, each nearly 4 feet long, were gone. All their heavy tools, drills, and picks remained stacked neatly near the worksite. Only their lighter gear was missing: coats, boots, and radio equipment. One of the troopers remarked that it looked as though they had stepped out for a short walk and never come back. But if they'd left on foot, the soft mud around the camp should have recorded their tracks. Instead, the ground was smooth, polished almost. They searched the fjord for 3 more days. Drones found nothing. The glacier itself seemed untouched, though one rescuer noticed a strange dark stain near the base, spreading outward like ink under ice. Samples later showed the coloration wasn't mineral or biological, it was simply air trapped under pressure, the pockets filled with fine particulate matter that looked almost metallic. Then came the fog again. On the second afternoon, it returned without warning. The sky dimmed and a thick, white mist swept down the fjord, forcing the rescue teams to retreat. The pilot who'd flown them in reported a heavy vibration through the fuselage, as though the air itself had density. He described hearing faint, rhythmic knocks, 3 at a time, coming from the glacier below. Later analysis of the aircraft's black box recorded a spike in electromagnetic interference exactly during that minute. 2 weeks later, an investigator found something wedged between the rocks at the fjord's mouth, a waterproof notebook belonging to Merrill Jensen. Its first few pages were soaked beyond reading, but the last entry was legible. It was dated July 12th, 11:19 p.m., hours after their last radio call. Fog came down fast. Dr. Vance says we're safe, but it's not moving like fog. Ben says he feels pressure in his ears like a hum. I can't hear it, but I feel it too, through the ground. The cores are cold to the touch, colder than ice should be. Eleanor says they're giving off static. She won't stop staring at them. There's something inside. She says it's just trapped air. Ben disagrees. He says the shapes look coiled. The fog's thicker now. Eleanor just said something is coming out of the glacier. She said it like she already knew. That was the last line. The remaining pages were blank. The official report concluded that the team had succumbed to environmental disorientation and exposure, possibly after attempting to move the 300-pound cores across unstable terrain. The missing equipment was attributed to wind or water displacement. But those who participated in the rescue never accepted that. One of them, Lieutenant Paul Haskins, said later that he had seen something on the final flight out. As their helicopter lifted off, the fog cleared just enough for him to look down at the glacier mouth. He saw a depression in the ice, long and perfectly oval, like something large had recently melted its way free. And at the edge of it, faintly visible through the thinning mist, are 3 parallel drag marks leading toward the water. That fjord is closed now. Officially, it's listed as unstable terrain due to glacial collapse. Unofficially, locals avoid it. Fishermen say their sonar goes haywire near its entrance. Others claim to see the fog there even on clear days, hanging low, dense, and pulsing, as though it were breathing. Sometimes, in the stillness between tides, a strange knocking sound echoes across the water, 3 slow beats, always the same distance apart. They say it's the glacier shifting, but some believe the fog isn't weather at all. It's something that woke when the researchers dug too deep. Something old that remembers being frozen and now wants its place back in the air. The last photograph recovered from Merrill's ruined camera shows the team smiling in front of their camp, backs to the glacier. But when a digital technician enhanced the image, he noticed something behind them. In the shadow of the ice wall, half shrouded by mist, there's a shape that doesn't belong. It's tall, too tall, and bent slightly forward as if watching them. No one noticed it at the time. The technician quit his job a week later. He said the image wasn't the disturbing part. It was the metadata. The camera's internal clock had time-stamped that photo 3 hours after all 3 researchers were already missing.
The island sat alone at the far end of the Aleutian chain, a spear of volcanic rock jutting out into the gray Pacific. There were no trees, no roads, no neighbors, just cliffs, black sand, and the wind, always the wind. That's where Arthur Davies, 56, took his final post. He'd been a lighthouse keeper most of his life, the kind of man who found comfort in solitude. His wife had died 2 years earlier, and his daughter, Clara, lived somewhere back east. After the funeral, he stopped answering her letters. When the government offered him one last contract to maintain a decommissioned light tower near Unalaska, he accepted without hesitation. 3 months alone, they told him. Enough time to catalog the remaining logs and decommission the beacon permanently. He arrived in early October aboard a small supply cutter. The crew helped him unload fuel drums, rations, and a weatherproof chest of maintenance tools. Before leaving, the captain, a grizzled man named Hurley, warned him about the storms. "They move fast out here," he said, "sometimes faster than sound." Arthur only nodded. "I'm not afraid of storms." Hurley looked him over for a long moment. "Good. Then just don't be afraid of what comes after them." For the first 2 weeks, Arthur lived by routine. Wake at dawn, check the lantern, clean the lens, log the wind and tides. He wrote letters to Clara in the evenings, though he never planned to mail them. They were a way of talking to someone without needing a reply. The lighthouse itself was sturdy, steel-framed, 50 feet high, built on a slope of volcanic basalt. The sea below was violent,
waves breaking against the rocks like fists. From the lantern room, he could see miles of open water. Some nights, when the sky was clear, he thought he saw faint shapes moving beneath the surface, long and slow, like the shadows of whales. The silence became his companion. It began on the 15th night. The wind had died suddenly, leaving the air unnervingly still. Arthur noticed the birds first. The seabirds that usually circled the cliffs had vanished. Their absence made the horizon feel hollow. That evening, while recording wind direction, he felt a vibration under the floorboards. It was faint, like a hum rising from deep below the rock. At first, he assumed it was a distant tremor, volcanic maybe. But the sound wasn't random. It pulsed, low and rhythmic, like something breathing through the stone. He made a note in his logbook. Deep resonance in the bedrock, rhythmic, possibly tectonic. By morning, the noise hadn't stopped. It seemed to move through the tower walls, vibrating the glass of the lantern. When he placed his ear to the floor, he could feel the hum inside his chest. Later that night, the birds returned, but not as they'd been. They swarmed the light, hundreds of them, smashing into the glass until the lens rattled. Arthur ran up to the lantern room, shouting and waving his arms, but they didn't scatter. Their wings beat against the glass until blood streaked across the panes. When he finally turned off the lantern, the birds vanished into the darkness as quickly as they'd come. He cleaned the glass until dawn. His next letter to Clara was different. The birds here behave strangely. They move in circles, like they're trying to block out something above them. At night, the fog doesn't drift, it rises. Sometimes I think I see shapes in it, standing where the light hits the ground. He stopped writing for a few days after that. On the 20th night, he awoke to a metallic scraping sound. The lantern, which rotated automatically, had stopped moving. He climbed the spiral staircase to inspect it. When he reached the top, he found the glass lens frosted over from the inside, a thick, milky coating that glowed faintly in the lantern's light. He touched it with his gloved hand. The frost was dry, not wet, more like ash. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw something shift inside the lantern housing, something darker than shadow, moving against the beam. For a moment he froze, then he stumbled back, nearly falling down the stairs. The air inside the tower felt heavier, charged with static. He heard a voice, or thought he did, soft, like a whisper behind his ear. "Turn it off." He ran down and cut the generator. After that, his journal grew erratic. The neat handwriting turned jagged. The hum is back, louder, coming from the rock. Saw movement in the light again. The shadow moves opposite the beam. The fog has weight. It presses on the windows. When the supply cutter returned a week later for its scheduled drop, the crew found the lighthouse light still functioning, steady, rotating as if nothing was wrong. But no one came out to greet them. Captain Hurley led the inspection himself. The front door was unlocked. Inside, the air smelled faintly of ozone and something metallic. Arthur's quarters were neat, his food untouched, his journal open on the table. The last entry read, "It only takes what stands in the light." His rain slicker hung neatly on the wall. It was frozen solid, coated in a thin layer of volcanic ash, though the nearest active volcano lay 50 miles away. Arthur was nowhere to be found. The official report called it an accidental fall. They said he'd likely gone out during bad weather, slipped on the rocks, and been pulled into the sea. No body was ever recovered. The logbook and lantern records were sealed by the Coast Guard, though rumors spread quickly through Unalaska. Fishermen claimed that during heavy fog, they could still see the lighthouse beam flickering, even after the generator was shut down. A year later, a new keeper named Thomas Laird was assigned to dismantle the tower.
On his first night, he climbed to the lantern room to inspect the mechanism. When he reached the top, he found the glass fogged again. Just a thin film, enough to distort the reflection of his own face. Then, as the wind died, he heard it, a low vibration rising from the foundation. He tried to ignore it, but when he glanced at the far wall, he saw faint writing scratched into the frost. Just one line. "You left the light on." Laird left the next morning. The tower was officially sealed, its records archived under infrastructure closure. But locals still report seeing the light from the cliffs when storms roll through, the beam sweeping slow and steady, though the power was cut years ago. Some say if you stand on the rocks at night and wait long enough, you'll hear the hum beneath your feet. Others swear that if you stare directly into the lantern's glow, you can see a figure moving inside the glass, a tall man in a heavy coat, face half obscured, turning the beam by hand. When the fog lifts, the light goes dark again, but the hum remains, deep in the volcanic rock, steady, pulsing, waiting for someone new to stand in the light.